Sometimes I forget that y'all aren't oppressed like I am. Like, y'all don't have the multitudes of levels and layers of just flat out oppression. And even being an amateur historian and understanding this and having my daily life experience, I sometimes forget that this isn't that way for y'all. And then at the same time, I forget to look at my own history. I'm somehow stuck looking at myself through the eyes of people who don't understand my experience and being like, why am I weird? The answer is I'm not weird. I'm just black, or I'm just trans, or I'm just queer, or I'm just disabled. Like, actually, these things are incredibly normal for people who have my life experience. But I spend so much of my time not being represented by the world that I kind of get in this weird spot where sometimes I fucking forget. I'm like, oh yeah, like this moment exactly right now. I do a lot of speaking, and I do it really casually, but I think really hard about it. And often when I have to do a public engagement, I don't really plan it out super well in the traditional sense. See, even there, traditional sense, the white sense, in that way. I don't plan out my speeches, my lectures. Instead, I kind of play this game where I have like this massive amount of memorized facts and ideas and abstractions, and then I take it, I apply it to the topic, and then apply it to that specific audience. So just like with my DJing, if you ask me what I did at any given time, I probably cannot tell you, but I do know it was probably pretty good. The problem is, like how I use the phrase traditional, sometimes I get in this headspace where I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not good at speaking because I never script myself. I never actually write down a script. I never cite my own citations. I don't do this thing. And I'm realizing, sure, if I were white, one could say that, and it would at least make sense. But I'm not. And I just picked up this book at the library that's from 1782 to 1900 of black speakers in America speaking on all kinds of stuff. And it's like, it's classy as shit. And I'm just sitting here, I'm like, I knew we existed. I know about the oral tradition. I know about orators. I know about, like, the importance of the orator, of the preacher, of the speaker in our culture. And yet I never really like thought about it. When you think about those time periods, at least for me, I think of slavery and those who were enslaved. I don't think about those who were enslaved that bought their own freedom and then went to make very large, very eloquent, very beautiful public speeches about the ills of slavery. And you're just like, I never thought about it. And then you read it and they're like, well, you're reading kind of the intro and they're saying, like, well, one, most of these got destroyed because of course they did. And the fact that these exist at all is kind of profound because there were basically no avenues for black public speaking. And yet these got written down or transcribed. And the reality is most black public speakers at the time did exactly what I was just saying that I do for my speeches. But I have internalized that that's not good enough, that that's bad, because that's what everyone tells you. That's what white culture tells you you're supposed to be like. That's what is professional, which is also white. That is, like, how my literal college public speaking class went. You had to do it this way. And yet, so here I am thinking, oh man, I'm shit at this. Or at least, like, maybe I'm not sure I should claim this as an art form that I do, even though despite the fact that I'm literally doing it all the time. And I'm like, oh, yeah, as soon as you change the lens of which you're looking at the thing, this thing no longer seems like a weird thing that I'm doing and actually just a normal practice that a lot of people do. And there's a ton of historical precedent for it. And I don't know, I'd be thinking about my oppression in this way sometimes, where And I say this to other people often, a lot of times with mixed folks, I'm like, oh, that thing about you that you don't like, that's from this part of you, or in this part of your heritage. But it's always so weird the moments it comes up for me, where I'm like, oh, right, I do live most of my life in white culture, and I am also an old soul, so I'm finding myself pulled towards older and older versions of blackness, older and older black traditions than the average black person that I know. And so I constantly feel like I'm still out of step with everybody else somehow, even black people I know often. But then I look at these books and I pull them out and I remember my grandfather and I remember spending time with him and I remember like being in West Virginia in the summers and realizing that actually it's because of the it's not only just because of the age bracket of the people I ended up spending time with who are typically a lot older, but just like those traditional values were so much closer to the surface than some of the more modern black values. But we don't even like that concept isn't even one we talk about. We talk about black culture like it's this thing that's been consistent over time, and it just hasn't. And besides the fact it's not a monolith, like it's not been consistent, and there are different types of it that are inconsistent. And so I find myself pulling from like both the really old like public speaker academic parts of the culture and also the like gay queer parts of the culture, but the older version of it. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with modern black culture. I think there's some beautiful things about it, and I like a lot of it. I appreciate a lot of it. I love all the art that's coming out. It's just again, I just find myself like slightly unseen in it, only to realize, oh, I'm just not going far back enough. I'm not going far back enough, and I'm looking at current day whiteness or current day blackness and being like, where am I? Where do I fit into this? At what point did people like me get lost and feel alienated so much when if you go back far enough, you're just suddenly like, oh, there I am. There are people like me. This isn't new, which I know, but sometimes you forget. And I forget that people don't have this experience. I forget that people don't. I forget that the average majority member, let's say, because I don't even want to say white people, because it's not even just whiteness, but I forget that people of majority don't experience this. They don't have these moments of, oh, right, that makes me unusual. As well as there are so many experiences I have that are so difficult and so much more complicated, and yet are normalized to me, and then I tell people about them and they're like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like, I'm thinking about passports right now and my name change, and how somebody recently decided to glance at my credit card when I went to pay for dinner and noticed that my name hadn't changed. And it's fine, but it's one of those things where it's like, people are like, oh, why don't you do that? I'm like, well, it's expensive. As of a couple years ago, you had to like literally publish your name in the newspaper several times, and in some states you still do, to just like inform people that you changed it. You have to go to court. Like there's a bunch of steps that you have to do beyond just like a marriage, getting married and being able to change your name. It's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. And so then when people are like, well, have you left the country? I'm like, well, no. And they're like, well, why don't you have a passport? And I'm like, well, one, I'm black, and I'm a poor black. And then two, like, where am I gonna go? Like, people don't think about this. Of like, I have to think when I want to travel of where I can actually be in the world and it not be an issue. And there's not that many places, just like there's not that many places I can be in this country and have most of my rights. Not all of them, just most. I'm just looking for most. I don't know. Do you be thinking about this? Is it just me? Does anybody else have these moments where you realize that, like, I don't mean like, oh, I'm born from a wrong era. Like, that's ridiculous. I would not want to go back in time. That's not what I'm talking about. And it's not even like there's anything wrong today or suddenly I've got different value systems or things like that. It's just as simple as, is it just me who can't seem to see themselves in society today? Is it just me who occasionally has these moments of, oh, right, I'm X. And therefore, the way I do this thing is not going to be reflected in the world. Or to talk to a friend and have a moment where you're like, oh yeah, I guess you can just, get a passport today. Like, you don't gotta jump through all these extra hoops. Oh yeah, I guess that's right. You can just do that. Isn't that wild? Isn't that wild? That's all I got.
Yeah.